Welcome to the VO2 Lounge podcast. In this episode, I'm going to be talking all about the ketogenic diet. This episode will be a little bit more involved than some of my others, so be prepared. I've done my best in making this to use both the technical jargon and include brief, simple definitions of things, but the ketogenic diet has proven to be quite complex, way more complex than the 5-minute YouTube videos kind of make it out to be, and the mechanisms at work and the effects it has. And for this reason, I thought it was worth dedicating a full-length episode to this. I'm going to make a kind of shortened, condensed version that may or may not be out, depending on when you're listening to this. But if you're looking for a fairly in-depth kind of summary of the diet, then this is the place to be. Okay, so let's start with kind of a brief overview. Nutritional ketosis, which is the end point of the ketogenic diet, is achieved by restricting carbohydrate intake, moderating protein consumption, and increasing the number of calories obtained from fat. So most people are already probably aware of this. Theoretically, this restriction of carbohydrates causes the body to switch from glucose metabolism as its primary means of energy production. This results in the use of ketone bodies from fat metabolism, a metabolic state where the body prefers to utilize fat as its primary fuel source, mainly because you are physically forcing the body to utilize fat rather than glycogen in the body. So recent studies utilizing low carbohydrate, high fat LCHF diets, such as the ketogenic diet, show promise in helping individuals to lose weight, reverse the signs of metabolic syndrome, reduce or eliminate insulin requirements for type 2 diabetics, reduce inflammation, improve epigenetic profiles, alter the microbiome, improve lipid profiles, supplement cancer treatments, and potentially increase longevity and brain function. Man, the list is endless. This is why I think people are kind of so obsessed with it, because even if you don't read a paper on the ketogenic diet and you just kind of rely on short snippets from publications like media outlets or YouTube, I think the list of possible benefits is so long and so heavy hitting that it just means there's so much content on it and people are really curious about this kind of what may seem, and kind of to some of it is, a kind of radical diet. So a little statement here: the number of Americans and Europeans suffering from obesity, diabetes, and metabolic syndrome is obviously clearly on the rise. We can see that around us, more so in particular countries, our wealthy places like the UK and the USA. The markers of metabolic syndrome, the things that like kind of highlight it, include an increase in the abdominal adiposity, which is just basically abdominal fat around the kind of main, body region. I don't know how else to put it. Insulin resistance, which is basically a poor response to insulin and the breakdown of the ability of your body to move between fuel sources. So it's just usually heavily dependent on glucose and just really forces you in a way to consume food really almost constantly. Elevated triglycerides, which is the fat found in the blood, hypertension, which is high blood pressure. So all these things are associated with metabolic syndrome. All of these negative health markers increase the risk of cardiovascular disease, diabetes, stroke, Alzheimer's disease, and the ketogenic diet has gained immense popularity during the last decade, primarily because of its successful short-term effect on weight loss, but also all these effects already spoken about by myself. So, yeah, I think it is, for most people, I think a lot of people probably are curious about the ketogenic diet, mainly because of its potential for weight loss. And I think sometimes the other benefits can get a bit lost, but here we will talk about all of the benefits as greater detail as I can. Okay, so without going any further, gotta get the disclaimer out of the way. I like to get it out of the way because, it interrupts things. But the content and materials featured or linked to in this podcast are for your information and education only, and are not intended to address your particular personal requirements. The information does not constitute medical advice or recommendation and should not be considered as such. I am not a medical professional and therefore I'm not able to give medical advice. Okay, so let's start off with some history. I have put some timestamps in the description, so if any of these points that come up are not to your interest, then feel free to skip through, filter through, and go to the points that you would like. But for the people who do want to know about it, here we go. The therapeutic ketogenic diet, which severely restricts both carbohydrates and protein, is typically used in the treatment of epilepsy and cancer. The concept of the ketogenic diet was initially developed in 1921 by Dr. Russell Wilder. I think that's how you say his surname, Wilder, for the management of refractory seizures in pediatric patients, effectively for treating epilepsy. Originally, the diet consisted of a 4-to-1 ratio of fat to carbohydrates and protein. Fat provides upwards of 90% of the of your caloric intake, and then all variations of this diet, whether involved in animal or plant-based derivatives, are based on severely restricting overall intake of carbohydrates, with the goal of bringing it down to less than 50 grams a day, which is probably a lot less than anyone normally consumes. That's what makes this kind of challenging for a lot of people. A well-planned dietary ketogenic diet, however, will have a protein limit of about 1 gram per pound, essentially 2 grams per kilogram of body weight, or 1.5 grams per pound of body weight for individuals performing heavy exercises, or heavy exercise in general. So this is kind of, to be honest, the protein side of things, I think you can just basically, most people are going to, most of the time, struggle to get this amount of protein in anyway, so it's less of a concern, I would have thought. Additionally, the diet does not restrict fat intake while decreasing appetite and caloric intake, resulting in the weight loss observed after initiation of the diet. So the fat just helps kind of with satiation for the most part, but effectively, if you calculate your protein calories, assuming you'll be eating as close to a gram per pound as possible, then the rest, bar 150 calories, because 50 grams equates to roughly 150 calories, but 50 grams of carbs will be coming from fat. So that's the way I kind of would go about it. From what I read, I would just find roughly a protein target that I want to meet, and then from there, essentially the rest of my food is going to be fat. Really, the rest of my calories would be coming from fat. So that's a kind of very brief overview. So a bit more information to go with this on how it works. So following carbohydrate deprivation and depletion of glycogen stores, the body undergoes metabolic changes to provide an energy source for the body through gluconeogenesis and ketoneogenesis. Gluconeogenesis is the process that transforms non-carbohydrate substrates such as lactate, amino acids, and glycerol into glucose. And it can be sustained for roughly 3 days with adherence to a low carbohydrate diet, so something below 50 grams. And then subsequently, additional energy sources are necessary to meet the metabolic requirements of the body and the brain. It's just you can't function otherwise. Your body's not going to kill itself because it hasn't got glycogen available. This is where the process of ketogenesis becomes indispensable, and the formation of ketone bodies is then used as the primary energy source by cells with mitochondria and, most importantly, the brain. So the brain obviously needs its glucose. So rather than just getting it from these raw glycogen stores, you can now utilize those fat stores. And this is kind of where it starts getting into, people talk about a lot about fat as fuel and kind of don't always necessarily realize how important that is, because often with people who are, say, insulin resistant, you've just lost that ability to some extent. It's not saying that you know it needs to become the only thing, but in a period of time like this, it becomes incredibly important. So its effects. Now I'm going to split these into various categories. So again, the description will give you those categories if you are looking for a very specific thing. But let's start off with the fact that the ketogenic diet has been shown effectively to lead to weight loss, and reduction in hyperinsulinemia, and that's basically in the name. It's just the amount of insulin in the blood is higher than normal, so it reduces that back to a kind of normal level, and in an improvement in insulin sensitivity. So you when insulin is released, you store that blood glucose more effectively. You don't need larger and larger and larger volumes of insulin to do so. So let's start with the one that a lot of people probably are interested in, which is the effects of the ketogenic diet on weight loss. So various pieces of existing evidence suggest that the effectiveness of low carbohydrate ketogenic diets in weight loss and in loss of fat mass, like they've shown that it is effective. A recent study showed that the high protein diet also effectively reduces the hepatic fat, which is fatty liver. There's a lot of talk about this fatty liver disease and so on. It helps reduce that. On the other hand, excessive intake of carbohydrate is harmful to individuals with insulin resistance. Most people who are overweight or obese are insulin resistant. Therefore, it's kind of easy to go from that if a high intake of carbohydrates can be harmful for these and cause these illnesses, then a ketogenic diet is going to have a high impact on diabetes and obesity, simply because it's cutting out that source. There's several possible mechanisms for the role of the ketogenic diet in reducing body weight, and they have been suggested in many forms. Each gram of glycogen is stored in 3 grams of water, and so therefore the initial weight loss could be due to glycogen depletion and water excretion. And so that's kind of one of the things people may see instantly. So I think it's important to know that you may see a drastic loss in weight and then like this kind of, not plateau, but a steadier trajectory downwards. And it can be demoralizing to some extent because you get this massive high. So it's important to know that this is going to happen, and it's not that this is some wonder like diet. It is that this is sort of semi-part of the process. There's usually also a decrease in metabolic efficiency, resulting in greater loss of energy in the form of heat and in the form of ketones in the urine, sweat and feces. Ketones also have a diuretic and appetite suppression effect. High fat content in the diet delays digestion, providing a sense of fullness that people often refer to in many cases. So you've got kind of two things here. You've got a suppression of appetite. You've got a reduced kind of digestive rate, and then more importantly, the utilization of fat as the body fuel promotes fat loss and therefore weight loss. And the better way of putting it is your body is reminded of its ability to utilize fat and how much it likely in some cases is in abundance on your body, and it can run itself on this rather than constantly searching for glucose in the blood, which obviously is what is happening to a lot of people. They're just constantly pounding in more and more food to keep that blood glucose level high and the body brain happy. An example of a long-term study. This study monitored weight loss as well as changes in visceral fat mass during a DEXA scan. Visceral fat around the organs, and DEXA most people probably know, but it measures body composition effectively, and then the visceral fat is, like I've just said, fat around the organs. The study by Moreno et al. Compared a very low-calorie ketogenic diet to a low-calorie diet. So one is ketogenic, the other is simply low-calorie, low-calorie. So the low calorie group is obviously has freedom as to what they're eating to some extent. Participants in the active stage consumed 600 to 800 calories a day and 50 grams of carbohydrates per day until they were 80% of the target weight loss goal, which was stage 1. Urinary ketone strips were used during stage 1 to confirm a state of ketosis. So, you've got a control measure there. Then they used a standard low-calorie diet, which was 10% below total metabolic expenditure during stage 2 until they achieved another 20% weight loss, followed by a long-term maintenance of weight loss in stage 3. The comparison control group used the low-calorie diet throughout the study to achieve weight loss. The weight loss in kilograms in the very low-carbohydrate diet was double that of the low-calorie diet throughout most of the study and remained significant. The amount of visceral fat loss in the very low-carbohydrate diet, or very low-carbohydrate ketogenic diet group was 3 times greater than the control group, while preserving lean body and skeletal bone mass. However, none of these side effects were severe enough to cause the participants to drop out in the study, and most subsided within the first month. These are quite common in general, so don't be alarmed if you have any of these. Really, there's usually a list of kind of issues that obviously pop up, like nausea, headache, fatigue. It's obviously got its diuretic effect, so you're going to be going to the toilet more, and there can be a few vitamin deficiencies, which we'll get on to kind of the end. I wanted to keep them all in one place, but most of them, some of them will subside in time. But effectively, what you can see is that the low carbohydrate versus the ketogenic diet, likely the mechanism is the fact that you could still have quite an elevated blood glucose level and make your body quite stubborn to releasing the fat mass. So you may both see weight loss. That's the thing. That's why sometimes saying you want to lose weight is kind of not necessarily actually what you're trying to do. You're more trying to lose fat, because you could lose weight in different ways. You could lose it through really your fat, or you could lose it through water, and you could also lean mass. Water counts as lean mass, and you're not trying to lose muscle mass really. You're trying to minimize muscle mass loss while maximizing fat loss, and clearly this abundance of glucose in the blood is sort of inhibiting that kind of process. The ability to control hunger is also a key component to weight loss success, obviously. That's one of the biggest things. It's really hard to try lose weight when you are constantly hungry. So studies have shown that negative correlation between the ketogenic diet and this substance called BHB levels and the urge to eat and feeling of hunger during the phase of maximum ketosis. Then this is supported by other large investigations in overweight and obese adults, who also found that low carbohydrate diets were more effective in controlling hunger and low fat diets. And I think that partially can be because you've got things like this. There's like a leucine effect, effectively, where there's kind of an amount of protein that you need to consume before muscle protein synthesis really kicks off. And so effectively, unless you're stimulating that, your body is kind of still not eating itself, but it's consuming this fat in a way that may trigger, this muscle in a way that may trigger more hunger. And I feel like if you are restricting carbohydrates so heavily, and meat tends to have fat on it, if you're getting fattier cuts of meat, and therefore your protein intake is probably going to be higher on a ketogenic diet than necessarily on you could have a low calorie diet and have it planned very well and still can eat the correct amount. But I think just the sheer volume of fat and protein is going to be the thing satiating people and allowing them to adhere to the diet much better than necessarily the low just the low calorie diet on its own. So it's a common trend for the levels of ketosis to relate to positive differences in food cravings, alcohol cravings, physical activity, sleep patterns, and sexual activity. This outcome is backed by the thought that postprandial glycemic dips are best predictor of appetite and energy intake following a meal, and large glycemic dips are usually associated with high carbohydrate consumption. So obviously the way for your blood glucose to peak, well, simply high carbohydrate meals are thought to have the greater impact on brain reward and homeostatic activity in ways that impede weight loss and maintenance. Interestingly, the increased brain activity findings were partially associated with higher insulin levels too. Generally, the ability of the ketogenic diet to reduce hunger, lower glycemic fluctuations, and concentrate influence on areas of the brain associated with addiction are all positive signs that the ketogenic diet should be considered as a treatment option. But just overweight in general, or obese people, and just for weight loss, because that's the thing. If you take the kind of one mechanism that is firing up that blood glucose level, and we've all kind of felt it before, you have this massive carbohydrate dense meal, you feel really full, and then quite shortly after, when maybe an hour or two, when this huge crash happens, I feel like as people, we kind of live our lives based on maybe not a rate of change, but differences. So, like comparing now to then, and how much money I had then and how much money I have now, and we tend to feel those differences. So, on a ketogenic diet, your blood glucose isn't going to spike anywhere near as high, and so when you go from a state of feeling satiated to, say, a couple of hours later when you haven't eaten, the difference between when you'd just eaten and were full to now where you're just resting isn't as big as when you have this massive carbohydrate meal and you have this huge high, and then you have this huge lull. Even if you come back down to baseline, it's just that difference is what you're really, I think, feeling, and why it is so hard to stick to a diet that still involves a large amount of carbohydrates. And it's partially what I do. I don't go all the way to a ketogenic diet, but the thing I usually cut when I'm when I'm just trying to lose a bit of weight for whatever reason, is carbohydrates, purely because it just makes adhering to it so much easier. It's an easy thing to measure, and it mainly bulks out the meal, but when it's taken away, I think because then that glycemic rush is even lower, it makes it really easy in comparison to stick to the diet. For me personally, is my honest opinion. But yeah, right. Let's move on to its effects. Other effects in general, but the effects on diabetes. Okay, so for the most part, I've already really spoken about kind of its effects on diabetes. But many of the diabetic complications have been linked to elevated levels of glucose over long periods of time. So just chronic raised levels of glucose, which is measured as hemoglobin A1C, HbA1c, which is a way of measuring your average blood sugar levels over the past 2 to 3 weeks, and it's kind of like the gold standard. Type 2 diabetes is caused by hyperinsulinemia, and insulin levels are directly affected by carbohydrate consumption. So you can see where something like the ketogenic diet would have an effect, because if a disease is caused by chronically elevated, abnormally high levels of insulin in the blood, and then you have a substance that is the key driver of that, if you then eliminate it from your diet, then it's kind of clear that this is going to have positive outcomes. Protein intake can cause slight increases in blood glucose and subsequently insulin secretion, but fat consumption has no major effect on either. If hyperinsulinemia is directly affected by nutrient intake, then it's Clearway argued that these blood markers could be controlled by continuous control of food choices. So I think maybe if you are, say, someone who's severely kind of obese in a way, then you could go to something that is strict in limiting protein as well. But I still think I'd kind of shy away from it a bit. And then definitely if you're someone who's just going onto the diet, isn't really that overweight, has a good amount of muscle mass, then keeping that protein intake high while you're on the ketogenic diet would be key to maintaining that muscle mass. You've got the effect on lipidology, so just kind of your fat profiles, your lipid profiles. The main concern regarding the use of the ketogenic diet with a high protein and fat content is that this diet will cause adverse effects on altering your lipid profile drastically. That's the main concern. On the other hand, several recent studies have demonstrated that low carbohydrate diets produce significant benefits on the lipid profile in the end. Following the administration of the ketogenic diet, there was a reduction in total cholesterol, increase in HDL, and a decrease in levels of blood triglycerides. Saturated fatty acids that are involved in increased risk of cardiovascular disease and insulin resistance are found to be more associated with dietary carbohydrate rather than dietary fat and protein. So again, now people may take away from this that it's like you can never eat carbohydrates again. This is not really the purpose of this. It's just to highlight the possible pros and cons of the ketogenic diet, and if nothing else, also just highlight that maybe moderation or adequate feeding of carbohydrates relative to exercise and activity and mass and everything should be considered a lot. So I mentioned Alzheimer's disease earlier, so it's important to sort of talk about the effects of the ketogenic diet on the brain. The effects of the diet on the brain appears to be well supported and is thought to be specifically due to production of BHB. They found that BHB is more than the fuel for the molecule, and it plays an important role in cell signaling. As a result of the positive impacts of BHB, one study found that BHB precursor molecules improved cognition and disease progression in Alzheimer mouse models, and showed improvement in an actual case study of a patient with Alzheimer's disease. The presence of, so I should probably say what BHB is. It's B-hydroxybutyrate, which protects neurons from oxidative damage by the increase in the antioxidant agent known as reduced glutathione, something or other. But effectively, it just protects the brain. BHB also inhibits NF-κB, which is known to regulate the expression of multiple pro-inflammatory genes. So from this, it can be said that the endogenous effects of BHB produced by the ketogenic diet might enhance health and increase overall longevity. And it's a might. There is some research towards it, and it's what the takeaway from this effectively is that it upregulates various protective factors, and just protects the brain in general from just damage over time, really. Okay, so the first kind of bit that people interested in sport and athletes in general is this bit, the effect on oxidative stress. So the benefits of the ketogenic diet might also go beyond treating existing diseases and instead help prevent chronic and degenerative diseases. There are arguments to say that the state of nutritional ketosis would positively affect mitochondrial function and enhance resistance to oxidative stress, and noted that the ketones directly upregulate proteins that influence antioxidant defenses. You may have heard of oxidative stress thrown around as a positive for exercise and wonder why it's a negative when talking about diet. Well, the difference is that diet will cause this chronically, whereas an exercise regime will cause this as an acute factor. Meaning it's just one is just pounding away at your mitochondria, the things that are effectively doing the fueling as such, / creating, utilizing the oxygen and the fuel to create the ATP at the muscle. So these are critical functional pieces of your biology. And by abusing them chronically, they get damaged. Whereas this acute is a bit like going to the gym. Going to the gym is a kind of an acute stimulus / damage to the muscle rather than chronically wearing away at it. So the ketogenic diet's mechanism of action might be due to increased levels of adenosine, which blocks DNA methylation and thus exerts an epigenetic change, simply meaning that the increase in adenosine in the body could be causing the expression of certain genes in the body to exert the changes seen. So this kind of flows in nicely somewhat to the effects on cancer, a disease that affects a lot of people nowadays and can be linked, I suppose, to one, the fact that we live quite long lives in some cases, and two, it can be dietary and environmental, and there are a lot of unideal things in how we live and where we live nowadays. So the potential of the ketogenic diet to aid in cancer treatment is still up for debate. However, the positive results seen in mice warrant that this metabolic therapy should be evaluated more, really. From studies presented, it appears that this next bit here I'm going to read from. There was a meta-analysis, and effectively they said from the studies presented, the ones that they presented in the meta-analysis, they said that it appears that the mice and humans, the diet seemed to be most beneficial when used as an adjuvant with other therapies and when administered as soon as possible. So basically, they believe that it should be something that should be used alongside it. And the concept is, I think cancers are heavily anaerobic and love glucose effectively. And so one way of helping suppress them is they think the ketogenic diet may have positive impacts on the pathogenesis of cancer, although the determination of it is used as a monotherapy or adjuvant therapy in humans needs further study. So they just basically came to the conclusion that it needs more study. Right now it's not a primary source or method of tackling cancer, but more that it presents an additional mechanism to support the already, say, chemotherapy or other methods used to fight off the cancer. Okay, and then, so this is kind of my largest interest on the diet. I think the weight loss side of things doesn't necessarily, just because of my current composition, it doesn't interest me as such. I don't feel like it's necessary for me to maintain / get to a leaner state. But sport-wise, it has always interested me. So studies of the ketogenic diet and endurance performance are somewhat sparse and heterogeneous in terms of athlete caliber, duration of adaptation, and types of exercise protocol. So effectively, they're just very homogeneous to some extent. Overall, they suggest that the performance of a moderate intensity exercise, so somewhere up to about 70% of VO2 max. If you want to know more about VO2 max, I do have an episode already on it. But essentially just your maximum oxygen uptake for a given time period and a given mass. But it's effectively saying that moderate intensity exercise may be prevented following ketogenic adaptation. not prevented, may be preserved. But individual results may be extreme in both directions and include an inability to tolerate or comply with the dietary restrictions. Importantly, there is no evidence of a consistent performance enhancement even at such intensities. So effectively, you might break even at that kind of lower intensity. Performance impairment of high intensity exercise. So some saying as early as 70%, some saying as late as 90% of VO2 max is likely and potentially attributable to reduced exercise economy, higher oxygen cost, effectively. That prevents the athlete from sustaining workloads at high portions of their maximal aerobic capacity. And I think it's kind of obvious to some extent. I think 90% is probably pushing it pretty high. Maybe if you're extremely well trained and your capability to utilize fat as the primary source to fuel yourself needs to be pretty high to be able to perform at 90% of VO2 max. But even then, I think you just need glycogen really to blood, like high glucose levels in the blood to really tackle that. So I think 70%, maybe 80% is probably your safe bet. So these findings support earlier kind of suggestions that the low carbohydrate ketogenic diet may be unsuited to events in which high intensity exercise is critical for success, but may have utility in specific scenarios such as moderate intensity exercise that can be supported by fat oxidation, especially in the presence of an inability or unwillingness to use strategies to maintain high carbohydrate availability. Basically, ultra endurance athletes may utilize this as they have no interest in large sudden bursts of energy. So people doing, bike packing trips around the world, kind of like 40-50 hour stints, really, like really big days where you're not necessarily you are in a race, but the race there's no point where it is determined by your ability to put out an output for even an hour, really. Maybe you might have some ridiculously close event, but for the most part, it's determined by how long can you sit on a bike or run before needing a rest, and how long do you need to rest for, and how efficient you are during these periods. So in contemplating effectively the potential use of a ketogenic diet in terms of sport performance outcomes, endurance athletes really should do an audit on their event or personal experiences to identify the relative importance of their capacity for high intensity aerobic exercise versus the risk of depletion of carbohydrate stores. There's many that suggest including taking an audit of the average of critical power production required in an event for the individual athlete and whether fat oxidation can support this. That's quite complex. I think really, if you're really serious, you could do that. But for the most part, I think previous experience, if you're doing a race that's an hour long, I'd consume carbohydrates basically. If you're going on a big bikepacking adventure, then I'd just eat whatever you can. So I wouldn't even say it's necessary to then stick to the ketogenic diet. You just eat what you can. There was an analysis done on Ironman triathletes. This I thought was quite interesting. That noted that elite athletes work at higher absolute rates of energy expenditure and a higher proportion of their individual energy expenditure ceiling than their slower counterparts. Modeling of the characteristics of the top finishes, for example, in speeds, power outputs, and exercise economy of running, cycling, and swimming. This suggests that enhanced fat oxidation, typically of keto adaptations, would fail to support requirements of an 8-hour finish times. And now, obviously we're below 8 hours, so clearly not, but might be sufficient for energy needs of slower competitors with times of 12 hours. Now, I personally just think if you are already carrying out a Ironman, why put yourself through dealing with it in a ketogenic state, personally? Maybe you have something to prove, or you're doing it for a charity, or trying to promote some kind of cause. But if your sole aim is to achieve a time, then effectively this is just saying what I personally live by at the moment. Just don't do it. There is some evidence to say that maybe a lot of these studies are like 10 to 15 weeks. Some of them are 30 days of adaptation. Yes, it's not loads of time, but, if you're, say, 20, even if you're 22, and you just want to get a lot of training in for your physiologic peak at like 25 or whatever, taking 2 years to experiment with a diet that may end up not benefiting you is a big commitment. So I think it's going to be a while till we see a clearer picture as to whether it can, in the long run, support high intensity work. So now, last but not least, a list of the drawbacks. Negative events of the ketogenic diet include dehydration, dyselectrolytemia, which is just like electrolyte imbalance, hypervitaminosis, which is a vitamin deficiency. In addition, short-term the ketogenic diet impairs bone mass density and mechanical properties of bone. Therefore, to minimize the above mentioned side effects, daily supplementation of electrolytes, multivitamins, potassium citrate and calcium, vitamin D and minerals should be given during the period of a ketogenic diet. I say given, you should be taking them effectively. So I also have an episode on the kind of vitamin supplementation, which ones do what. By the sounds of things, to be fair, if you're doing this diet, you may end up being so heavily deficient in some of these that it's important to supplement. But I suppose it would be good to do further investigation into, or even talk to people who've done it, what their blood work came back as. And that's another thing you can do. Blood work, I think, with the ketogenic diet is quite important. Although expensive, and maybe if you're only doing this for 3 months at a time, then maybe not necessary, but still a good idea to get some kind of insight into the effects it's having on your body. So another side effect of the ketogenic diet is the formation of kidney stones and the increased production of and the decreased excretion of uric acid. This is due to the limited fluid intake and the suppression of thirst by ketone bodies and hunger. It should be noted that the studies from a laboratory have observed a decrease in serum level of urea. To rectify this issue, inclusion of 5% carbohydrate composition in the diet is recommended. So effectively, they're just saying that you should just consume more carbohydrates, 5%. But yeah, it's not great. I've heard the kidney stone thing a few times, and mainly I think because of the lower fluid intake and lower ability to kind of hold on to it, and the electrolytes as such. You need to find a way to effectively keep fluid retention. Another concern regarding the ketogenic diet is that its subjects who are on this diet have a reduction in the intake of healthy foods such as fruit and vegetables that contain polyphenols and antioxidants that fight against free radicals. Type 2 diabetes is associated with the oxidative stress, and limiting the supply of polyphenols and antioxidants may increase the imbalance of antioxidant oxidation system in our body. In order to overcome this situation, it is suggested that supplement the ketogenic diet with extracts of polyphenols and antioxidants, especially in patients with type 2 diabetes. So Effectively, it's the kind of diet where I think you should cycle on and off. Maybe doing this permanently isn't great, so maybe just do 3 months, or maybe the first time you do 6 because you've got into it, and then it turns into a kind of cycling diet. But I think that's the thing. There are quite a few things that I possibly get deficient in, like I think any diet, like the vegan diet, which again covered in the past. Getting a fairly rigorous supplement kind of regime, an idea of what you're going to become deficient in, is kind of key if you're going to take this on for a pretty prolonged period. And then finally, constipation is also has been noted in the past as a side effect of the ketogenic diet, which could be due to the decreased fiber content and dehydration due to the suppression of thirst by ketones. This situation can be prevented by increasing the fiber content in the diet, increasing fluid intake, and using laxatives. I'd avoid obviously laxatives, so maybe things like prune juice, I suppose. I know it's got sugars in it, but it's a lot of counting. I think you have to do your due diligence with this diet. You have to already restrict carbohydrates and such, and I think it can be quite the hard diet to follow. But the list of benefits, as I have already gone over, are extensive. So I think it's something worth giving a go, especially if you are, your BMI is like, say, 30 plus. I think it's something that could be quite critical. But if you're an athlete, sounds like it's not. So again, as always, if you've made it this far into the episode, thank you for listening to today's episode. If you want more content like this, there are plenty of other previous episodes to check out. But before you do, why not follow the podcast and leave a rating wherever you get your podcasts from? If you want to suggest a topic for future episodes or want to get in contact in general, then email me at thevo2lounge@gmail.com. And with that, I'll see you in the next one.